Hello, welcome to my first attempt painting. No, that's not what I'm doing. Welcome to my first attempt at filming a miniature painting video on this channel. I'm painting this little guy. Get in frame, sir. And talking through my process, coming at miniature painting from the point of view of a professional illustrator. If you don't know, I'm an artist who's worked on stuff like Magic the Gathering, painting these guys, Dungeons and Dragons. I did a cover for Black Library, and I've done some other Warhammer work over the years. So I've been working for like 15 years as an artist now, and I've loved Warhammer since I was incredibly young. My first box was the second edition Warhammer 40k box, the most beautiful box of all time, and I was absolutely in love with the kind of style of miniature painting at the time. I still have all my old white dwarfs from then, and I still go back and look at these insane paint schemes. So I was huge into painting when I was young, and then I just kind of fell off it for a while and got back into it in my 30s. And that's kind of where we are now. So I've been working on this Blood Angels army ever since I got the Leviathan box set, and I wanted to paint them in a kind of cool illustrative take on a mixture of oldhammer and a bit of that kind of Blanche, kind of dirty, grimy style. So it's kind of, I hope it's kind of an interesting style. I quite like it. Not going for an incredibly high competition standard, but like a kind of tabletop plus kind of look. Basically, I want most of these miniatures to take about a day to paint, and the one I'm going to be painting today, this chap, took about 6 hours and spread over 3 days. So enough rambling. I'm going to talk through my process while we go, but let's just jump straight into the actual video. Alright, so here is the boy that I chose to paint for this, one of my Blood Angels Terminators. I just went one with quite an open pose. And as you can see, I have already based it. I'll maybe do a basing video in the future because it's actually one of my favorite parts of the process. But I just used some bits and bobs from my various bits kits. The star of the show here is definitely Vallejo Thick Mud Acrylic. I use this on every model, and it's so good for putting together quick bases. But yeah, that's basically it. Chuck that stuff down, and then I primed it all with Citadel Color Mephiston Red, which is just like a good base tone for this process. Here I am just grabbing my captain to look at, to try and remember some of the colors that I chose and start thinking about the colors I'm going to need for this painting, because spoilers, they can be the same, of course. So, speaking of colors, let's start assembling the colors I'm going to be using for this scheme. I have so many paints. I have way more than I'm even showing here from different ranges. Tons of Vallejo Model Air stuff as well. I do work with this airbrush sometimes, but for this one I wanted to keep it pretty simple. So I'm just assembling the basic tones. Now you can do this with any set, mostly using Citadel here for this process, as well as a few of War Colors, Nostalgia covers, which are kind of like basically replicate the kind of look of the old Warhammer paints. So your Goblin Greens and all that good stuff. Here is an overview of all the paints I used on this scheme. I think I might have missed one or two, but this is pretty much it. So take a little screenshot of that if you want to use the same paints. You'll notice I'm not going to be using a wet palette for this one. That's because I was lazy. Normally I would use a wet palette for sort of bigger painting projects, but because I planned to do this in a day or so, I decided not to for this one. Here I am just taking photos of my guy so that I can do a quick mock-up of the scheme. This is something I talk about quite a lot when I'm chatting to miniature painters about my process. And here's kind of how it looks. Welcome to Adobe Photoshop. I'm just going to mask out the background, put them on a black background, tweak the values a little bit, and also remove that color so we can just repaint it. And basically I'm trying to remove some of the highlights and stuff from my photos, so I've got a nice steady base to work with. And this is my reference board. Another really important thing I think for the process is finding a bunch of references that you find useful, and I'm just going to color pick directly from this to start building my color palette here. Just tweaking the values when I need to, and just doing this super roughly, but it's really helpful to have a kind of visual reference on a laptop in the background while you're painting so you can remember what your plan was. You can also test out lighting schemes and stuff here if you feel comfortable doing that kind of stuff. If you'd like to see more of this, maybe in more depth, about my process, then please let me know in the comments. I can totally do a video going deeper into this stuff. But for this first video, I figured to keep it fairly loose and fast. So I'm pulling out some of the main colors here. Obviously the yellows, trying to figure out where they might go. In the end, I end up not doing the yellow shoulder pad for this guy because I quite liked having the red, and ended up moving yellow onto the his left knee actually. But this is just a super rough way to show you what the plan is going to be for this. So one of the key things about this army that I'm painting here, that I think that sets them apart from traditional Blood Angels, is that I do a blend from black to red. I just figured that was kind of a cool way to show that there may be falling or progressing towards ending up in the Death Company. I don't have a name for this chapter. Please feel free to suggest anything in the comments because I could really do with a good like chapter name for these chaps. But hopefully this kind of shows you what I'm going for here. And the cool thing about this scheme, which I enjoy, is that I basically get to do kind of two different styles of highlights. So the black armor gets the kind of traditional bluey gray highlights, whereas the red armor is going to get the kind of orange to sort of bone color highlight. And then I'm using blue for the eyes and lenses as a nice kind of contrasting color to hopefully make them stand out. And you can see I've pulled out some sort of swatches. And that's it. That's a really useful reference. Oh yeah, and also the base is going to be, you know, muddy, swampy, dirty, and gross. And so we're back on the table. I just wanted to show you the brushes that I'm using. It's kind of a weird selection of just bits and bobs. I've got some of these dry brushes by Citadel, which I use mostly just for kind of dusty effects. And then I have some really gross old brushes that I use for dirty dry brushing, as well as some nicer ones. You know, we've got some nice sable brushes here. Different kind of widths, different kind of patterns that I'm looking for here. Going down to obviously the thinner brushes. And we've got a couple of Series 7 beauties in there as well. I've got some really nice brushes here and there, but I actually don't tend to use them. I mostly, because the scheme for this is a little bit dirty, I'm quite happy to use whatever, really. All right, let's get painting finally. So first observation as I open these paints is that several of them were kind of messed up. I hadn't used these for months and they were kind of just gross and dry. So I had to do a bit of work to try and recover them. And actually, I ended up having to do to get a Vortex Shaky Boy to fix some of these, and actually replace 2 or 3 paints entirely. But to begin with, I'm just using a dirty old dry brush to get some of the good pigment out, mixing it in various amounts of water. So I've got a sort of thick paint, a medium thick paint, and a sort of wash. And I'm going to kind of combine these to give this model a quick once over with Mephiston Red, just to basically fix any of the issues with spraying. You know, when you're spraying from a rattle can, you sometimes miss parts. So we begin here by just cleaning that up, going over it all just to give it a fresh coat of paint and to make sure that we have a really solid base. So I'm watering down my paints here and just going for a couple of loose coats of this to clean everything up. Because it's quite warm in my studio right now, he actually dried pretty quickly, so I meant I could kind of do a couple of thin coats in a relatively short amount of time, and now he's ready for more painting. But first, I had to try and recover some of these paints. This Fire Dragon Bright was absolutely ruined. So I got this Vortex Paint Shaky guy off Amazon. If anyone's interested, I can put the information in the description. But you can see this paint is completely ruined. I tried to rescue it by putting some ball bearings in there, adding some water, poking it around a bit, but this guy ended up dying. However, before I replace him with some better paint, I had to go to the local shop to get some more. Please enjoy this Vortex ASMR for a minute, which sounds like a massive vibrator. Hot stuff. So we can finally begin with the process here. I'm going to start by shading this entire model with Reichland Flesh Shade. I like a nice dark brown that can get into all the crevices and give us some base shading straight off. The look I'm going for, as mentioned, is a kind of dirty, war-torn take on Oldhammer. So I want to start by establishing those darks straight up. So I'm just using a big brush here and slathering him entirely in this stuff. Now, this process is really similar actually to how I paint illustrations as well. I tend to work dark to light throughout my process. It feels the most like sculpting. It's like sculpting light onto the figure. And because I'm doing, you know, a little bit of light source stuff on this figure, nothing too intense. This is not a competition piece where I would do like maybe full-on light painting. I want to start off nice and dark, get right into the crevices, and then we'll work our way up through the different tones of the piece. So once that's dry, we have a nice sort of dark base to begin with. And now we're going to go in with an even darker tone. I'm going to use some Nuln Oil here to establish the super dark shadows. These would be called like ambient occlusion shadows, or occlusion shadows. Basically the parts of the model where light just wouldn't really get in there. And when you're painting, if you're maybe a bit newer, the easiest way honestly to do this is just when you're looking at your model under light, you'll see those places that light naturally doesn't fall, where the light is super occluded. And that's where I'm going to add this Nuln Oil. I'm still being a bit messy. I'm not being super clean with this because again, it's going to be kind of an oily, dirty effect for the model overall. But you know, under the helmet, behind any bright features, I like to add some of this just to make sure that the bright features pop. So the Aquila, or Aquila, I don't know how to pronounce that, is going to be like yellow and quite bright on his chest. So I make sure to get a little bit of that Nuln Oil around the edges of that, because that'll just make it pop even more. It's a little bit cartoony, but by the time we've done all the sort of nice rendering and shading, it should look more natural. Definitely struggling to show this in the light, unfortunately. It's kind of hard to film and paint, it turns out. But you can kind of see it's definitely got in, all those nooks and crannies are now really, really dark. And I've also added some of that Nuln Oil to the lower regions of the model where they're going to be black. So the knees, basically the legs up to the sort of crotch are black, and they'll transition into reds. So I'm just continuing to go around, work my way around here. And just finish darkening up all the areas of the model I want to be really, really dark. And the next step, continuing on this trend, is going to be painting all the black bits. So I'm bringing out some Abaddon black, Abaddon black. I always said Abaddon, but Abaddon black sounds weird. Whatever. Switching to a small brush now. This is going to my Series 7 little fine sable brush. So we can go in and paint the bits between the armor plates. You can see the Nuln Oil is still a tiny bit wet here, but that's fine. It's mostly dry where I need it to be, and I'm just darkening it down. This is something you're going to see a lot through my process as well. I quite often will paint over still slightly wet paint, and that way you end up getting slight blends as well. Wet blending is one of those techniques that's often made to sound really complicated, but it's actually fairly simple, and I'll go into it a bit more in the future. I'll show you how I blend the blacks into the reds, for example. But here I'm just getting a nice fine point by twisting the brush in the slightly wet Abaddon black. And once I've got a nice fine point, as you can see here, I can go in and paint all those little details that need to be black. So while I'm noodling away here, I want to take the opportunity to ask questions about my presentation process for this, because again, this is the first time I've done this. This is the first time I've recorded a miniature painting process. If you have any ideas of things I could do better, maybe better camera positions, please feel free to shout, because I have really good equipment that I use for recording, my painting stuff in general. but I don't really know what the best setup is. I mean, I watch a lot of other painters all the time. Massive Richard Gray fan, Darren, of course, all the greats. But I want to make sure that, you know, when you're watching this stuff back, that it's actually enjoyable and not a blurry mess. So please let me know in the comments if you do have any ideas for how I can improve this process. For any of the areas that are going to be yellow, like a lot of the stuff on the gun, for example, I'm obviously just going to keep those red for now, because painting yellow over black is incredibly hard. As you'll see towards the end when we start adding the hazard stripes and all the kind of details to the yellow, because of course you have to do a bit of working back and forth to fix little errors. But that pretty much sums up this stage, really. It's just going in, adding the black where I need it, and then beginning the fun part, which is starting to get this blend working. So I'm going to kind of show you what I'm doing here, and then I'll show you on a piece of paper what it actually looks like. But basically, when blending black into red or any other color, or blending any colors together, I like to get a pretty strong band of the darkest tone on first, like this. And the paint's very wet here, so it's very easy to come in with a slightly wet brush with less paint on it and just blend that together. So I'm just slopping it on at the bottom here. Nice and loose. The big brush, trying to make sure that I cover up any red at this stage. And then I'm just kind of licking my brush like an idiot to remove some of the paint pigment and using that wet brush to start pulling that paint up. And that will become less opaque as it moves up, and you'll start to get a bit of a blend going on. Now this is very easy to refine by going back over it with red, which I'll do later. And there's so many ways to do this. Like there's lots of different ways to wet blend. You can do two brush blending, which I'll show later on as well, which is where you apply the dark band with one brush and then you bring in another brush which has just got water on it and you blend that way. But this is a quick and dirty approach for getting that striking black to red transition. Sorry, the blend police were coming, because apparently I wasn't doing a good job. Now, the distance that this blend goes, I will refine as I go, but usually I like to get basically pure black up to the knees, and then it starts to transition up through the thighs, those like armor plates. And I'll basically move it around to wherever it looks good. Like on this dreadnought, for example, the blends change. I basically put different black to red blends on different areas where I think I want to separate the armor plates and make them look cool. But for this guy, much like the captain, yeah, it's like black bottom of the legs up to sort of the red really kicks in around the waist. So here, just a very quick example. Just laid down a couple coats of Mephiston red here. And here I'm taking my black tone, really thick, heavy base tone at the bottom, like this, and then washing off a lot of that paint. So really we're just left with water and blending upwards. So you can paint upwards. Now it's worth noting that the paint will come with it, so you actually kind of want to go down the way. But I find that what I can do is bring it up like that and then go in with more water and just do the same process again to remove at the top, and then you can blend up and down. This is a terrible example, but you kind of get the idea. if you nuance this a little bit, add a little bit more black in there with the water there, it will start to create a blend, and you can refine this as much as you want. You can make this incredibly smooth or a little bit oily, which is the look I want to go for. You can see how it's not super consistent, but again, the look I'm going for here is that these guys, maybe their armor was beautifully sprayed at one point, but over the years of battle, it's become dirty and messy. And once we start adding chips and damage over the top, that'll really hide some of those imperfections. So that's a good example of how to do this quickly without needing to go crazy on perfectly rendering. This is not heavy metal quality. This is a mess, but that's the point. So with the pre-shading done, I'm now going to go back in with Mephiston Red and just start cleaning this whole thing up. So basically going in and starting to bring the red back where I want it, remove the oiliness where I don't want it. I'm using a fairly fine brush for this, mostly a fine brush tip. And my paint style here will become kind of like stippling to some extent, but we're going to start off with sort of a decent flow, slightly watered down paint here, and I'm deliberately going to leave bits, like kind of gaps between the brighter red and the darker base that I already established, and that's going to help set up for sort of damage later on. I don't want a super clean, consistent red throughout this. I want to leave kind of gaps. Look at my knuckle shaking. What's going on there? At some point I switched to using a miniature holder, which will hopefully help with that. It's just funny when you hold the miniature at certain angles, your hand just goes fucking insane. You can see here, when we get to areas where details overlap other details, I kind of start using the edge of the brush a bit more to run the paint over. To just pick up on the highlight areas, or on the high areas, sorry, because I want to leave some of that darkness in between. So yeah, this takes a little bit longer here, but starting to just bring those strokes in and refine, bring back that nice bright red color. So you can kind of see here what I'm talking about, drawing the paint over these areas so that we leave a little bit of a shadow in between. But it doesn't have to be perfect. An interesting thing about light in general is that it bounces a lot. And this is something that doesn't often get represented in miniature painting, but it's worth touching on a little bit. Red as a color absorbs a lot of light, so it doesn't bounce as much as maybe other tones necessarily. It gets sort of literally absorbed into the particles. So while you're going to have deep shadows between the areas of red, they might not all be consistently black. I'm not going for that super comic book style dark shading. So if some areas of the darkness don't end up pure black, that's actually okay. It's actually more realistic. And that's some of the stuff that I want to talk about as we go through this painting process, of like bringing in an aspect of realism to the approach. So rather than doing the heavy metal style painting, which I love to look at, where every single edge is highlighted, there's like perfect shadows in between, everything's kind of lined and very, very clear, which makes a lot of sense for product photography, I want to aim for a slightly more realistic look to the lighting. So the shadows will not be all black. There's going to be blends between areas of highlight and shadow. And the texturing as well, rather than being super clean with like really clean fades between colors, there's going to be imperfections, bits where the light bounces off the armor onto other parts of the armor, and a little bit of a sense that there is a light coming down from above. So the tops of the model are going to be warmer, more orange than the lower parts, which are going to be a bit cooler overall. So now we're kind of arriving at the bit where we're going to start blending the red in with the dark black tones. And for those, I'm just gently introducing the red back in there. And because my brush tip isn't as clean now, it's a bit scraggly, that means I'm starting to naturally get some texture. So we're starting to stipple a little bit more here. You can see I'm just like laying in that wet paint. And it's worth noting, you know, any painter who's done this for a while knows, like, the color is going to be more vibrant when you first apply it and then become duller. And then once it dries and is duller, we can go over it again and really start to intensify those blends in a kind of messy way. Camera's really having fun trying to focus on this right now. And now that I've got my reds feeling good, the Mephiston red's been reintroduced, I'm going to go back in with my black with a very sort of watered down version of this wash and just re-establish that blend. So I'm spending a bit of time doing this up front just so that I don't have to touch it again later on. So there we go. Starting to gently wash in the black again to sort of get it to the right consistency so that you see the blend in person. It's very hard to see in the video, to be honest, but hopefully you can understand the process a little bit here. Just very light washes, bringing it up like that, letting it dry, then doing it again until we've got a kind of smooth blend between red and black. Right, I'm happy with that. So we're on to our first highlight color here, which is Evil Sun Scarlet. And I'm going to be painting this on top of our red areas, of course, on the areas where the light would naturally fall. And at this point, you can see the stippling I was talking about. So stippling is really just applying still wet paint in little kind of dabs, allowing for a little space between the brush strokes. So you're going to start getting like a natural sense of divots in the armor. It's not consistently smooth, you know, the armor pitted and damaged over years and years of use. So doing this approach with the highlights as we work our way up through increasingly light tones, we'll start to build out that sort of 3D sense on these smooth planes. You can see obviously I've damaged this model a little bit with some scratches and a couple of bigger holes from heavy weapon fire, but I also want to add texture everywhere throughout this process. And stippling's a really, really good way to do that. So I'm just kind of dabbing the armor with this paint, letting it dry a little bit, dabbing it more and more. And the more we do that, the more we build that sort of 3D sense. So here we are again with my little card. Another terrible demonstration. Sorry, I can hear my dog coming over. She's like, what are you doing? But yeah, just dabbing these strokes on like this. And as you let that dry and you do that more and more towards the highlights, you're going to get a brighter and brighter color, but you're also going to get more and more texture, which is what I am all about. Okay, so Brandy the Chihuahua has joined me for this part of the painting process. Do you have any useful insights you'd like to offer to the people at home? How do you feel about wet blending? Alright, so here we are bringing my Wild Rider Red onto the helm, which I think is probably a good place to sort of see what's going on here. You can see I'm just highlighting it as though it was lit from above. So picking out those top planes, bringing that color in there to start bringing the light in there, making it feel more three-dimensional. This is very much the same technique I was talking about before, where I'm actually brushing down over these areas where the light's going to be hitting, leaving the crevices nice and dark, really picking out the edges. And this is like the way I edge highlight as well. I'm not going for super clean edge highlights, just kind of brushing the sides, trying to get as many of them as I can at once because I'm very lazy. But it's going to start establishing that nice kind of gradient highlight on the top that I really want to get. Camera going absolutely insane here, trying to focus. But you can see the kind of dabbing strokes that I'm doing there with the slightly messier brush. And hopefully you can catch with that wet paint is picking up the stippling to begin establishing that nice gradient. Alright, next highlight. What a... Easy, tiger. Don't you be falling over. Wild Rider Red up next. Slightly lighter, slightly more orange. Same approach. But as you might expect, we're now going to be highlighting on an even smaller area. Picking up more and more towards the top and stippling more and more with even lighter paint at this point, because I don't want a crazy strong transition here. I want to sort of take my time, build it steadily. If you want to do an even quicker scheme than this, you know, as mentioned, I think this took about 6 hours total. You could totally do this with thicker paint or in bigger steps. That's usually how I see, you know, tabletop stuff done. But I want to sort of take my time a little bit with this. Again, I'm going for a kind of very polished tabletop standard that you could maybe show at a competition and people might be like, ooh, that's good, but it's not as good as these. And I'd be happy with that. So I'm just picking up on these top areas that I want to be a little bit lighter and stroking this in. Stroking this in. What an incredibly weird way to say that. Delightful. Next color, a very out of focus Fire Dragon Bright. So we want to be very sparing with this because it's very bright. We're just going to be using this for the brightest highlights pretty much. Not quite the brightest highlights, but the high highlights, especially around the helmet, the top of the chest, and picking out a few details on the top of the model. And we can see here I'm starting to really establish the two major highlights on this model. So as mentioned, one of them is coming down from the top left. That's the main highlight. It's going to be hitting the top of the helmet on the left side. And then a little secondary one on the right side as well, separated by shadow. Basically so that when you look at the model from the front left or the front right, both of those will feel quite dramatic. You absolutely don't have to do this, but I like to give a little bit of kind of light paint on the model to make it feel even more of an illustration, basically. You know, typically when we're rendering illustrations, we pick one key light, might be the sun from behind, or casting the major shadows on the model, and then often a secondary light or a rim light to pick out some other details as well. So I'm kind of doing a very basic version of that. Again, as mentioned before, I'm not going for full-on, you know, masterclass Golden Demon entry with like beautifully painted lighting. It's more sort of implying that a little bit, but doing it quite quickly and messily. So you can see the highlight down the center there on top of the Aquila. Aquila. Again, how do I say these words that have lived in my brain forever? But now we're really going to start bringing out that three-dimensional look. I'm going to push this back a little bit as we go. I like to, this is another technique I use a lot in my illustration work, where when it comes to the highlighting, I like to go a little bit too far deliberately first. And you'll especially notice that when we start bringing in the bone sort of highlight tones. And then we'll push it back with glazes to kind of make it a little bit less intense. Because I don't want it to be so textural you can barely look at the thing. Giving this shoulder pad some love because I know that I want it to be a major feature. And I'm not planning to put any decals or anything on it. I just want a sort of nice red to orange transition towards the top. And you can see now that all this sort of stippling is really starting to add to the 3D sort of textural effect. Now, another approach you could use here if you wanted, which is even easier and faster, would be dry brushing. So dry brushing, you probably know what that is, but it's, you know, essentially using a rough brush that you don't really care about, putting on a bunch of paint and then wiping most of it off onto a paper towel and using that to sort of dust on a little bit of paint. It's very effective for shading, and it can create a look very similar to airbrush work. But it's also quite chalky, and so I want to establish the base tones with paint strokes first, then we can introduce a little bit of dry brushing in a little bit. Okay, let's introduce our brightest yellow highlight. We're going to use some Dorn Yellow here. Now this is very bright, so we're only going to use this in very specific places, basically as a sort of extreme edge highlight to bring out the brightest specular highlight in that highlight I've been building on the chest and head. And I'm just going to kind of dot it on initially. Just looking for the edge of that highlight, which will flow down the model. And then also some of the corner points, the absolute tip where two angles meet. And I just want to kind of really highlight those areas there to draw attention to the head. Now, you may know this already, but typically with illustration work or miniatures, the head's really going to be the focus. That's where you want to draw the viewer's attention. So by having my brightest highlights around that area, basically the top third of the model, and kind of centralized around the head, we're going to draw the most attention to that area. You can see some of these are a little bit messy, but that's okay. I can go in and refine that later, especially because I will be knocking back the brightness of some of this in a later step. I'm also going to highlight some of this battle damage, especially this big old kind of hero wound here. Just highlighting around the edge with this nice bright color to make it feel more three-dimensional. And you can see for this, I'm starting to go a little bit messier. And this is where we go back to our stippling technique to continue using this highlight color to just draw more attention to that area and to add a bit more of that three-dimensional feel. Here we have a pretty good view actually of the shoulder pad and all of the texture that I've added to it. It's got a little bit of that chalkiness I mentioned that you get from dry brushing as well, but we're going to knock that back in I think the next stage once I bring in a little wash of saturated red, just to kind of dull that down a little bit. And here we have it! Nostalgia Colors Blood Red. This is a very saturated red, kind of like what you'd expect to see in Blood Angels of old. And I'm going to use it here with a lot of water to create a sort of glaze of very saturated red. And here we are just starting to glaze it in gently. I picked this shoulder pad first to test on, just to make sure it felt about right. And you're going to start to see that really it's just going to push back that chalkiness a little bit. Bring back more of the red, because I don't want there to be too much yellow or bone color in the actual bigger sections of the armor. I want them to still feel, you know, bright red on top, or relatively bright red. Not going for 100%, you know, 90s red here, but a little closer, not quite so dulled down. Now you might wonder why I would do this after spending all that time building up the armor, but I prefer a slightly more subtle look to the blends, and then to go absolutely ham with the scratches. It's a weird mix of subtle and completely unsubtle. Alright, with that done, we're going to move on to our first highlight for the black. I'm going to be using Dark Reaper. Really like this color. And I'm going to be painting it very much the same way we did our red armor highlights. So starting with some edge highlighting for this. I find edge light highlighting on black is the most effective way to paint black. I usually leave the bulk of the black armor just black and then just hit the edges. But being careful to bring in lots of nice scratches. And black is awesome to highlight because it's so easy to recover. So you can see I'm not being particularly clean with my edge highlights here. I'm doing, you know, I'm going in with like a pretty sharp brush tip, but if I make any mistakes, it's super easy to fix by just bringing in the Abaddon black again and tidying them up. So black armor, extremely fun to paint. It's worth noting that the lower parts of the armor are going to get a ton of battle damage. My imagination here, these guys are walking through this muddy battlefield. It's all scratched up and covered in mud and dust. So I'll actually be pushing back a lot of these effects later on by bringing in a little bit splashed mud from the base. That kind of dust, I'm going to use dry brushing to sort of paint in a nice warm brownish tone over the bottom of the armor. So I really don't need to be super clean here. But just working away at this first highlight before we move on to a brighter grey. Also using Dark Reaper to paint the cables on the back. I want them to be kind of bright, just so the back doesn't become too dull. So Dark Reaper is a good base for that. Then we can wash it and do lighter tones on top. And now on to the first highlight for our black armor, which is Mechanicus Standard Grey. And just much as we did with the red armor, just starting to put that on the top parts, basically. I'll also be using this for a lot of the chipping and damage. So you can see I have a massive bubble of something on the hair here. which I decided not to clean off apparently. I think I will in a minute. Again, not worrying about it being a bit messy here. This isn't the focal point. That's another thing to think about here. The focal point in your painting is going to be the most detailed and have the most contrast. So for the rest of the model, I'm not worried about using slightly bigger brush strokes because I want to draw your eye to the small points of detail. So I'm going to go back and re-establish those bright point highlights on the armor, since obviously we knocked those back with the wash. But I don't want them to be yellow, so I'm instead going to use a bone color here, Screaming Skull in this case, which is very bright and perfect for picking out those little details. And I can also use this on the black armor later as well to bring some consistency to the specular highlight color. Keeping these a lot cleaner than the last version. Because basically, by applying the wash to the rougher highlights that I had earlier, I've softened them out, which means that these dot highlights will really kind of stand out nicely now. Now, the way I jump around between areas of the model is one of the reasons I don't think this is necessarily the most replicable tutorial, because I haven't exactly done it 100% the way that maybe like a traditional tutorial would. But it's just the way my brain works. This is how I paint illustrations as well. I kind of just jump about to whatever I feel like doing next. And while it may be more chaotic, it keeps me sort of invested in the piece mentally. And anytime I'm like, ugh, I'm bored of painting this armor now, I'll go do something a little bit different that's roughly around the right stage of the painting. So bringing this nice sharp highlight back essentially takes the entire piece to roughly the same place. We've got nice highlights on the black armor, we've got nice highlights on the red now. It's all feeling pretty consistent. And I think that this kind of bone, very light pale bone color is perfect for adding scratches across the model. So that's what I'm really starting to do here now, is like start to break it up a little bit. And these will be a great base once I add some dark tones in there as well to imply that these are actually three-dimensional scratches rather than purely surface level. Alright, here we are, back to Abaddon Black. So, first of all, let's go in here and clean up this black armor. Clean up some of those highlights so that they're a little bit tighter. And then we're going to use this as well for the chipping to sort of add three-dimensionality to it. That word? It is now. So keeping my paint a little bit watery here. Keeping my camera completely out of focus here. And just going in and tidying up those black bits. I want them to be nice and dark. And I'm now going to start using that black to pick out some little scratches and dents on the armor. Unfortunately, my camera thought, actually, why would I focus on that when I could focus on those ball bearings? So this is completely out of focus right now, and it will fix now. Close enough. Well, you can see a little bit of the stuff I've already done on that shoulder there. Just dotting it on very sparingly. So let me show you on a different area here. Using a lot of water here, a lot of water mixed into the paint, so that the capillary action will just fill those dents with a nice dark black. And here and there, just dotting it around a little bit to add more texture. Now this is something I really love to do. Adding just a little bit of that black to the edge to break up that edge highlight makes the whole thing feel so much more realistic, I find. Because realistically those bits would be really pitted and damaged by gunfire aiming at his head. So just by breaking into those edge highlights a little bit, you make them feel much more 3D. I'm also going to go back and re-establish some of my nice black tones that maybe I've got lost at some point in the highlight process. It really is a lot of back and forth with the highlighting, the way I work. Not the most efficient, but it's fun. I like to over-highlight, dull things down, then re-highlight, and then I'm maybe happy by that stage. Don't know what it is, but every time I do a really sexy edge highlight, my camera loses focus. Very strange. But here I'm coming in with this kind of oily black again, just to re-establish the shadows along there so that the edges really pop out. And the same for the eye sockets. Again, like I said earlier, anything that I want to be bright, I want to make sure it has a nice dark edge or shadow around it, so that those blue eyes, when I finally paint them, should hopefully pop really nicely. Jump scare, blue horror. Another of my favorite colors, beautiful pale blue that I'm going to be using here to bring out some of the scratches on the black armor and use as an additional highlight for the black armor. And I don't think I need to dwell too long on these steps now. You kind of get it, right? Like, it's exactly the same process again. I just do the whole highlight process twice. Because I'm insane, I think. So let's just wrap this bit up here and move straight on to the next section, because it's just more highlighting. I want to keep things moving. Vibrator ASMR break. Uriel yellow. Uriel, I don't know, Ariel. This is going to be our yellow base tone color. It's quite a bright one to start with. Normally you would build up to bright yellows, but because I'm going for that slightly dirty look, I don't mind doing 2 or 3 coats that are fairly thin and having it not be perfectly bright. You can see it's leaving a right old mess, but that's actually okay because I can use those to inform areas of scratches or just fix them if I want to. Of course, I also need to go over and base coat this Aquila. And his left knee as well needs some too. I kind of love how it looks with this super bright yellow. It's so cool, but obviously we need to pull that back a little bit in the next step. Alright, to save a little time here, because this video is already almost an hour long, I painted in some of the damage onto the yellow, just using Mephiston Red to maintain consistency in colors. So exactly the same approach as before, just a few little cuts and streaks here to imply that the armor is damaged. Now we're going to move on to Macragge Blue, which I'm going to be using for the eyes and also for the glass bits. What are they called? Viewing lenses? Lenses! That's the word. So it goes without saying, everyone hates painting lenses or eyes. It's incredibly intricate work. And I don't have any particularly great insights into this other than make sure your undercoat isn't too thick so you're not losing detail. Keep your brush very sharp. And I like to have quite a lot of paint on the brush, not too watered down, to make sure I get the first 2 major strokes that I need to get the color in here. So you can see I'm being very careful, holding my breath even, and just carefully washing in that first color, which is the base coat there. Now we're going to highlight this shortly, but just want to make sure that I get a nice strong color into those lenses off the bat. While I wait for my blue to dry, I'm going to quickly jump in and do a glaze over the yellow. This red glaze was actually a little too strong. I probably should have watered it down some more. But I use it to my advantage by turning it into sort of a gentle saturation adder. Just adding a little bit more saturation to some of the red areas where I think it would be nice. And also using it to just sort of gently darken down or tweak the color saturation of the yellow a little bit. As you can see here, just kind of brushing it in. Much more watered down this time because I learned my lesson, to sort of dull it down a little bit before we move back onto the blue. Alright, so for the second lens, or the first lens highlight, coming in with Calidor Blue. And this time, rather than getting the entire lens, I want to get most of it except for the edges. So same deal as before, just being super careful to kind of keep it within the boundary that I established, that first coat. That drying, you guessed it, we're going back to the yellow. We really are just bouncing between the two colors right now. Just grabbing my Uriel yellow again, wow, it's hard to say, and bringing back the brightness to the Aquila that I really deepened with that glaze before. So I'm being careful with this layer and just trying to establish the bits that pop out. All the raised edges get a little bit of this yellow. And anywhere where I think I just kind of dulled the yellow too much, gets a little bit of a hit. I'm also going to go back in here with red and clean up some of those edges. Because as you can see, it's a little bit of a mess there. Okay, great. We're going to return to highlighting the yellow shortly, but taking a break here to bring in the Dark Reaper again and start to paint that thing on his shoulder. The annoying thing. I hate painting these. I don't know, I find them quite difficult. They require, if you want to do them well, it requires a lot of intricate work. But let's start with base coating it for now. Oh god, and there's one on his knee as well. Ugh. So same deal, I'm just going to base coat that quickly as well. With those painted, I'm going to reward myself by doing some more highlighting. So I'm going to bring in some Dorn yellow here, that super bright yellow we used a little bit of earlier. And I'm going to use this just to kind of clean up and highlight the yellow that we put here on the Aquila, arm, gun, and knee. Also, while I have it here, I'm going to bring a little bit back onto that armor. A gorget? Is that what you'd call that? Just a little edge highlighting again to bring the brightness up there. Because I can't stop highlighting. I love it. Speaking of things I love, it's time for one of my favorite parts of this painting style that I have invented, I guess, because it doesn't make any sense. It's dry brushing. I want to blend these transitions a little bit better, and I want to bring a little bit more roughness in. So we're going to dry brush the upper edges and some of the edges here with Fire Dragon Bright. I'm using a stippling approach, just dabbing this on or sometimes brushing with the very edge. Not using much paint at all, but this gives you a really nice gentle edge highlight, and it builds on all the texture we've already put underneath it. Might not show up very well in the video because it's quite subtle, but yeah, it's going to really build those transitions in a big way now. So here, for example, just picking out the edges of those, of that lens thing, and then also just building the color here to produce a kind of hot highlight in the middle. So it really produces an effect kind of like airbrushing, but I feel like I have more control over this. I do have an airbrush and I've used it on projects before, but I like this kind of gritty effect you get from dry brushing, especially when you have a solid base upon which to work. You can see here that I can use the same technique to not only highlight the red armor, but also to dull down the yellow. And it gives that really nice kind of broken up, stippled texture that I was looking for earlier very quickly. And here I'm just bringing a little bit more paint in when I want to get a slightly sharper transition color or edge highlight. Now I can use the same approach to highlight the yellow. I'm going to do that with Screaming Skull. And exactly the same approach here, just catching those edges and bringing in a little bit more variety to the color. Now I'm also going to use this technique to start highlighting the center of the Aquila. So just typical dry brushing here, nothing too fancy, but it's a nice way to quickly pick this out. But the thing to remember, as I mentioned earlier, is that dry brushing can be quite chalky. So you can see it's not like a smooth transition color. So we're going to go back in with paint just to kind of clean that up after this. I'm also using it very sparingly along the main highlight to just bring that up a little bit further and to cool it down so it's not just pure yellow. So here we are doing just that, going back in with our Screaming Skull. You can see I've already fixed up the Aquila and painted the skull. Unfortunately it was completely out of focus, so I couldn't really show it, it was kind of pointless. But yeah, now just re-establishing the sharper edge highlights on top of smooth blends. Also just remembering to go around and paint all the little skulls and little scratches and things on the armor that I think could do with a bit more detail. Alright, 20 minutes of non-stop bone highlighting later, and it's time for a different color. I'm going to go and do the final bright highlight on the eyes, and that's using Blue Horror again. That lovely bright pale blue color. So I'm being super careful here. My plan with these highlights is to kind of bring them just on top, up into the corner ideally, and then later I might break them up a little bit with the medium blue again, to get the feel that there's like a highlight on both sides. But I'm not being super precise with this. Again, this isn't a hero figure. And oh god, I fucked it. Oh no. But it's okay. Grab another brush, dab it with some water, and see if you can quickly dispel that before it settles. So there we go, we fixed it. No need to freak out. Everything's fine. Alright, so now we're going to deal with some of the other bits and bobs that we haven't really finished. So I'm going to come in and paint these little cross things on the shoulders. My approach for these, and I did this on the captain as well, is to come in with quite a light highlight here, this standard grey I think, and push it towards the top edge so that it kind of blends out into the darker grey. And if I do that around each of these, and then reverse that stroke pattern on the other side, we get a kind of non-metallic metal style treatment. So I'm pushing the highlights into the corner and then I'll reverse them on the edge. It's a little fiddly. honestly, as I said earlier, I'm really not a fan of painting these things. So I try and do them as quickly as I can. But it kind of works. And of course, the same approach for the knee. And then I will use this color to add a little more detail to the scratches on the black armor, since I've spent the time refining them on the red armor. You can kind of see up at the top there, you know, we've got kind of nice different levels of scratching on the armor. It's starting to feel quite good, to me at least. And now coming in with the brightest highlight that I'll hit on any of the armor. This is White Scar, and I'm just using it to pick out the tips of the different details again, and just any bits across the entire model that feel like they could be brightened, including the skulls, anything like that. It feels like it could just do with a touch more brightness. So yeah, a pretty exhaustive amount of highlighting on this one, back and forth. I hope it wasn't annoying to watch, but this is just how I work. I kind of dot around the piece, dull things, brighten things, fix them, repeat forever until I somehow decide that it feels good. But I like it, I enjoy it, and that's the big takeaway here is you don't have to necessarily work to a set pattern. You know, you don't have to follow a tutorial 100%. You can just kind of do what feels right. And this method that I'm using here is really just, it could absolutely be refined, but it's fun. So why not do it this way? I'm going to use my White Scar here as well, just to dot out the brightest highlight on the glasses, lenses. And now for something completely different. Let's do the base. Since we're nearing the end of the painting process for the Marine, I want to just step away from it for a little bit, so I can come back at it with fresh eyes in the morning. So I'm just going to come in here and paint the base. Now I'm not going for a super high level of finish on the base because it's not strictly necessary. The style for the bases in this army is very much kind of dirty, swampy, battleground. So I'm going to start off here, coming in strong with a slightly watered down inox hide, just to kind of cover the whole thing, just with a big brush. And then once that's dry, come in with a range of colors that I'm just going to kind of mix randomly. This is an old painting technique you'll see a lot in like master paintings as well, where people would, like artists like Sargent might paint different colors onto the same brush tip, and then allowing those different colors to kind of impact each stroke you make. But for now, we're starting just with this rock, using that kind of flat, dirty dry brush that I've used a lot earlier, and just with a little bit of Administratum Grey on there, and just stippling that on to start picking out the bright rock. I like the bases to have a few bright elements, and then a few kind of dirty, swampy, messy elements where I'm just mixing colors at random. So you've got a few bits that pop, and then the rest kind of just blends into earthy, natural tones. And here, I'm just wiping my brush down and mixing a few colors in, some grey, some scrag brown, and just using a kind of stipple dry brush technique to hit the higher areas, or bits where I just want to introduce a bit more light into that base before we begin washing it. Now, if you didn't want this to go on the model, you could obviously use a smaller brush and take your time with this. But I'm quite happy for some of this to hit the bottom of the boots, because that kind of just ties the whole thing together. And you'll notice from the way I've painted the light and so on, that something I'm really interested in is consistency throughout the piece. This comes back to illustration work, where you want to use the same tones, you know, across the character and the background. Basically, this is like a miniature version of that, where I'm going to bring some of this muddy scrag brown and the darker browns in here, the Rhinox hide, into the figure as well to tie them together. So it's like the model you could almost look at as a gradient from light red to black, and then from black into brown, and it just ties everything together. You obviously don't have to do this, but for this piece, that's how I wanted to approach it, and I like the look it gives. Yeah, you can see I'm just dabbing it into the bottom of the armor now with this messy brush, and it creates stipple patterns. To push that even further, I'm now switching to this big kind of soft dry brush, and just taking some of that scrag brown and the other paints that I mixed on my palette, and I'm just dabbing it on. And you can see that creates stronger patterns now on the bottom of the armor. This is very fun. I love just dabbing paint on stuff. Even going over some of the gray there to give it a more naturalistic hue. Just trying to think, you know, if this is a messy, muddy battlefield, everything's going to have a little bit of mud on it. I let that sort of semi-dry, and then start coming in with washes to bring some depth into the tone. So I'm using Reikland Flesh Shade here. The three washes I use on the base are Reikland Flesh Shade, the browns, Coelia Green Shade, I believe, to add a little bit of sort of dark bluey green in there as well, and a little bit of Nuln Oil here and there just to add deep shadows. And I'm not being clean with this. I'm just doing very much the same kind of effect as earlier and using this to kind of tie everything together. You'll notice I'm not leaving this to dry either, because I want these colors to mix on the palette. On the miniature, not the palette. That doesn't make any sense, Paul. This way you kind of get nice, more naturalistic blends of these different colors. So while my wash is drying, I'm going to go back in and paint some of the things that I forgot, like these purity seals. Just going in with bone color, pluck them out, then we'll give them a little wash soon, and we'll do the writing and stuff right at the end. I like to leave detail work until the end of the piece. So again, much like my painting process for illustrations, I try and work zoomed out with big paints for as long as I can, and then kind of right at the end zoom in and do all the little kind of super noodly stuff like the text or any decals that I want to paint. I didn't actually end up applying any decals to this figure because again, he's not like a captain or anything like that. So I don't want to add more detail than the captain has, for example. And that's just so when I've got a squad of them, they don't stand out more than, you know, the big guy. I'm going to just sort of tidy up anything I missed, eternally going back and forth. And here I'm using that same bone color to bring out some highlights on the black armor as well. And again, that's just helping tie everything together. When you have consistent colors throughout the piece that are repeated, it means that every part of the piece, from the base all the way up to the top, feel consistent. Now we come to the most annoying piece of the entire project, because I ended up losing about an hour or two of work for my SD card. Through my own stupidity, I would like to add. All of this detail work I was doing where I painted in the stripes, finishing off the base with dry brushing, different colors, all of that got lost. So that's incredibly annoying, and I'm really sorry that I can't show it in the video. Basically, it was my own fault. I was copying files from my SD card, and then I accidentally thought it was done, deleted the files from the SD card, realized my mistake, and then went away to shout for a while. So I'm really sorry, but the final touches really were just repainting that Stormbolter side to black so that the skull and wing would stand out, A little bit more, detail and damage here and there, nothing you haven't seen already. And of course, the main thing is painting the hazard stripe and the blood motif on the knee. Now, to be fair, it's nothing you haven't seen already here. It's exactly the same process. For the hazard stripes, I just kind of loosely sketched them on with a very watered down black paint, then refined them, then went back in with the yellow to fix any issues, of which there were many, try and get them relatively straight. And then I highlighted them with our Screaming Skull and a little bit of white on the edges. So a very similar process to what you've seen everywhere else. But if people would like another video in which I go into that stuff more, I absolutely can do that. We could do like a deep dive on one particular part if you like, or we could just do a new model. Really, whatever people want. I hope you've enjoyed this process. I've really enjoyed filming it. It's been really fun actually going through the process again of this Blood Angel. But yeah, I'm just gonna paint the edges of the base black now to make them look sexy. And that'll be pretty much it. Painting the edges, I like to just take the side of the brush with quite opaque paint and just kind of do a few coats around to make sure it's nice and consistently black. I think it adds to the kind of diorama feel, especially if you get a little bit of black on kind of the edges of the anything that's poking out over the terrain, to make it look like it's kind of a cutout. I don't know, I think that's cool for some reason. Turn of the shaky hand. It's back. There we have it. One very messy, messed up, bloody, dirty Son of Baal. Finished to a decent standard, but not like a competition standard. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the process. It was really fun, as I said, filming this, making this for you. Please do let me know if you have any questions about anything I missed, for example, or if there's anything you'd like to see. I would love to do more miniature painting videos. It's so relaxing for me. It's such a nice break from doing, big old illustrations all the time. This is very much my hobby. It's just a nice way to kind of unwind and have a different kind of creative output from my illustration work or my game work. So yeah, I'm pretty pleased with how they look. Here they are all together. What a handsome bunch. Will I ever finish this army? I don't know. I'd love to. But my brain, it wants to do so many other things. I have a Keeper of Secrets I really want to paint. I have a lot of kind of big single models I'd like to do. But yeah, let me know what you think. I would love your feedback so much on the whole process of painting this, the video presentation style, etc. And yeah, I'm excited to share more with you in the future. You can find links where to follow me down below, but please say in the comments if you have any thoughts, and I'll see you in the next one. Stoked to do more. Thank you again for watching, you're amazing. Take care of yourselves, and I hope your painting projects are going great, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye!